Number how humans reached places no one had ever seen. Somewhere on a beach in the Pacific, roughly 3,000 years ago, a small group of people stood beside a canoe and looked out at open ocean. No map existed for what lay ahead. No radio, no satellite, no way to call for help. Behind them was everything they knew. Ahead of them was nothing but water, all the way to the edge of the sky. And they got in the canoe anyway. This happened again and again across human history in places that could not be more different from each other. A hunter crossing a frozen land bridge into a continent no human eye had ever seen. A group descending into darkness underground, torches in hand, with no idea where the passage led. A sailor pushing past the point, where every mapmaker before him had simply written unknown. Why would anyone do this? Why would a species that fears the dark, fears isolation, fears the unfamiliar, choose again and again to walk directly into all three at once? The answer is not recklessness. It is something stranger and far more useful. Start with the most basic version of the problem. Every unexplored place is, by definition, a place where your species has no accumulated knowledge. No stories about which plants are safe to eat. No warnings about which animals to avoid. No memory of where the fresh water is. Evolution generally punishes this kind of blindness. And yet humans, alone among large mammals, made a habit of walking straight into it over and over on every continent except Antarctica, long before we had any of the tools that make exploration feel safe today. The anthropologist and geneticist Spencer Wells has spent years tracing the genetic trail of this expansion. His research supports what's often called the recent African origin model. Every non-African person alive today descends from a population that left the African continent within roughly the last 60,000 to 70,000 years, and then kept going in waves until humans had reached nearly every landmass on Earth. That is an almost unbelievable spread for a slow, fragile, clawless primate. It did not happen by accident. It happened because something in human cognition made unexplored territory feel less like a threat and more like a question waiting to be answered. Here is the first piece of the puzzle. Curiosity in humans is not a personality trait. It is closer to a biological drive, similar in some ways to hunger. The neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, who spent decades mapping the emotional systems shared across mammal brains, identified what he called the seeking system, a deep neural circuit tied to dopamine that activates when an animal explores, investigates, and anticipates discovery. In most animals, this system stays tightly leashed to immediate needs like food and shelter. In humans, something unusual happened. The leash got longer, much longer, long enough that entire groups would cross oceans, not because they were starving, but because they wanted to know what was on the other side. That difference alone does not explain the full story. Though, wanting to explore and being able to survive, exploring are two separate problems, because wanting is not the same as knowing how. And this is where the second piece comes in. Humans did not explore as individuals. They explored as networks. Consider the settlement of the Pacific. One of the most staggering feats of exploration in human history. The islands of Polynesia are scattered across roughly 10 million square miles of ocean, many of them separated by thousands of miles of open water, many of them so small that finding them by chance would be like finding a single grain of sand tossed into a stadium. And yet, over the course of roughly 2,000 years, humans found nearly all of them using nothing but canoes, stars, waves, and memory. The historian and sailor David Lewis spent years studying with traditional Pacific navigators to document how this was actually done. What he found was not guesswork. It was an entire embedded science passed down orally, generation to generation. Navigators tracked the angle of specific rising and setting stars. They read the direction and shape of ocean swells, which bend and reflect off islands long before land is visible. The way sound bends around a corner, they watched cloud formations that form differently over land than over open sea. They noticed the flight patterns of certain birds that return to islands each evening. None of this required writing. It required an extraordinarily precise, multi-generational transfer of pattern recognition. This matters because it reframes the entire question. Ancient exploration was rarely a single brave, individual defying the odds alone in the dark. It was closer to a very slow, very careful technology, built by hundreds of people over hundreds of years, refined constantly, and only handed to travelers once it worked. The individuals in the canoe were not gambling. They were carrying the accumulated risk calculations of everyone who had tried before them. And the ocean was not the only place this played out. The same pattern shows up on land in an entirely different environment, tens of thousands of years earlier. When humans first crossed from Siberia into the Americas, they did not simply walk across an empty bridge into an empty continent. Genetic and archaeological research, including work associated with the Beringian standstill hypothesis, suggests that a population lived on the now submerged land bridge of Beringia for thousands of years before ever continuing onward into the Americas. They did not rush into the unknown. They paused at its threshold, sometimes for millennia, adapting, learning the terrain, building the accumulated knowledge that would eventually make the next step survivable. This is the part most retellings of exploration leave out. The bold leap into uncharted territory usually was not bold at all. It was the last step of an extremely long, extremely patient process of de-risking the unknown until it was no longer quite so unknown. But knowledge and patience alone do not explain everything either, because there is a third ingredient, and it is almost embarrassingly human: prestige. The archaeologist Patrick Kirch, who spent much of his career studying Polynesian expansion, any cases, discovering, and settling new islands carried enormous social status. Founding a new settlement, some researchers argue, could elevate a chief's lineage for generations. Exploration was not just about escaping danger. It was about winning something: status, legacy, a permanent place in the group's memory. Humans, it turns out, will walk into extraordinary uncertainty if the reward on the other side is being remembered. This gives us a fuller answer to the original question. Humans did not explore unknown places despite fearing the dark, the isolation, and the unfamiliar. They explored because three separate forces were pulling harder than that fear was pushing back. A seeking drive wired into the brain that made uncertainty feel less like danger and more like an open question. A network of inherited knowledge that quietly shrank the unknown before anyone ever set out into it. And a social reward system that made the discoverer, not just the discovery, worth remembering. And there is one more layer worth sitting with. Every single one of these explorers eventually became the known for someone else. The Polynesian navigators, who found and settled an island, were, from the perspective of the next generation, the reason that island was no longer unknown at all. The unexplored world only stays unexplored for the first arrival. Everyone who follows inherits a slightly smaller unknown, a slightly shorter list of blank spaces on the map. That is arguably the strangest part of this whole story. Humans are the only species that seems to treat the unknown as something that can be permanently reduced, generation after generation, until almost nothing is left. Every canoe that reached a new island, every group that crossed a hidden land bridge, every explorer who pushed one step past the edge of the known world was making the unknown just a little smaller for everyone who came after them. You are, in a very real sense, living inside the result of that project. Nearly every place on Earth you could travel to today was, at some point, a version of that empty horizon someone else once stared into. The fear did not disappear. It was simply outpaced again and again. by people who decided the question mattered more than the danger. And somewhere, right now, that same old circuit is still active in you. The one that makes a locked door not enough. The one that makes you wonder what is over the next hill, behind the next door, past the edge of the map. It is the same drive that once filled a canoe with people willing to disappear over the horizon on nothing but starlight and memory. The horizon has not run out. It just moved.